basic training and are on a controlled burn for the first time. We provide formal presentations, field trips to areas that are significant with fire management, such as a previously burned area or a treated area that has seen a wildfire visit. We implement controlled burns, and our curriculum is focused on basic firefighter safety, fire effects monitoring, local and regional tactics, and learning about management challenges and opportunities. And we integrate media training and experience. So this graphic shows our progress over the last several years. The top row, and it was completed near the end, or in the beginning of 2014, so we don't have those numbers, but I'll fill you in with our total numbers here in a second. So in that top row, you can see the number of participants increasing every year. And that second row with the pie charts shows the distribution of participants. And I'm not sure if you can read there, but in the dark green, or actually it looks like the medium green, is the Nature Conservancy, and that darker green is the Forest Service. The tan color are Department of Interior agencies. The blue is state agencies. The gray area are university students. And so what you can see is over time we've continued to diversify our participation. You can also see there the different habitat or areas that we're burning in. And you can see that we got our start in Texas and Nebraska working with Nature Conservancy fire programs, and grew our way out of the plains and into the forests, and then into wildland urban areas, and just recently have started conducting training exchanges out east in deciduous forests. The dots on the map show the different places that we've hosted training exchanges every year, and so you can see our growth and distribution of where we're conducting our training. Currently, we've had more than 1,000 participants between 2008 and 2014 complete over 90,000 acres of controlled burns. Many of these burns were adjacent to homes in the wildland-urban interface, where the actual front and backyards of people's property were burned on purpose. We are collecting lessons learned by way of after-action reviews, exit interviews with participants, evaluation forms, and satisfaction surveys. We are documenting the comments from the participants. We're learning what is working and what is not, and we're integrating these lessons into new solutions or aha moments that we integrate back into the next training exchange. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with this graphic of the distribution of fire regimes around the country, but I always think it's good to mention that 80% of the vegetation and terrestrial ecosystems in North America are adapted to the regular occurrence of fire. Indigenous people of North America were using fire extensively across the continent to provide for their own needs, including food and materials, war, and safety. One of the legacies left from those people is the distribution and the function of our forests, shrublands, and prairies. And so in the past 15,000 years, we've seen extensive burning led by people. And if we cherish and continue to rely upon these natural areas for the benefits they provide, we will also need to manage them with fire. And for those of you who work in the woods, in the prairies, and use fire, your eyes are adjusting to the different indicators of fire-adapted ecosystems. And so you can look at a riparian area like this with willows or an aspen stand in the middle ground, or a mixed conifer forest there, and you can see the the marks of the fire, even in a place, even in a photo like this where we don't see any burned areas per se, but we could zoom in on that aspen stand and see that there's several different cohorts growing on the edges. This area was burned 7 years prior. And so as we move around the country and we look at different fire adapted ecosystems, the trained eye can recognize these places that have fire. This is on the Powell Plateau on the north rim of the Grand Canyon. This is a ponderosa pine forest, and because of its isolation in the Grand Canyon, it has had very minimal grazing and suppression activities. It has had no logging, and so this is an ancient ponderosa forest that has had regular visits by fire, and so it's maintained its wildness. And in the prairies of North America, we can see the same thing. For those of us that are familiar with it, we can see the treeless expanses of our prairie is really an indicator of both fire and climate. And in the absence of fire, then we see the encroachment of woody shrubs and trees. So in 2011 and 2012, there was two papers written, one by Lania Quinn Davidson and Dr. Morgan Varner from Humboldt State University, and the other one by Mark Melvin from the National Coalition of Prescribed Fire Councils, with assistance from the state foresters. And what they did is they used surveys to identify what were the key barriers that were preventing managers from implementing controlled burns. And broken out regionally, this is what we learned, that these list of barriers were what managers were indicating were keeping them from accomplishing their burning. And so we've tried to look at these and figure out a way to bring neighbors together to accomplish more, better burning. And so what I want to talk to you right now about over the next couple of slides is a formula that we've put together that helps us scale up local capacity. Excuse me. So obviously part of that formula being people on the ground, creating partnerships, and having a passion or a commitment to overcome real and perceived obstacles. Having a place, a definable landscape with features and attributes needing to be protected or restored. Clear objectives that will help define success. Perspectives, both historical and contemporary, help us create a more adaptive model that will take us into the future. Our historical perspectives include cultural, economic, and ecological. Contemporary includes the socio-political, and then the adaptive is a blending of these perspectives to achieve resilient landscapes. Our planning process, both short and long term, incredibly important. Absolutely necessary to have clear objectives. Trying to avoid the analysis paralysis of never-ending planning, and actually trying to implement activities on the ground and learn from those actions. So learning by doing. And then adaptive management is part of these training exchanges is so important, and that's do it again and do it better. So taking those lessons learned from the past event and immediately applying them to the next event. Implementation. Embrace and manage the risk. Don't avoid the risk. Unwavering commitment to follow through. I think many of us could tell stories about how we've planned to complete burns or our partners have planned to complete burns, but something is constantly getting in the way. And so we have to have this unwavering commitment to follow through. So I had a couple of photos in here as placeholders so that we might take a pause and see if there were any questions. But feel free to put some questions in the chat box. And in fact, I'm reading one now. Okay, well, Susan, there's a paper that talks about that definition between cooperation and collaboration. And I don't have that in front of me, so I'm not going to be able to tell you, what a more articulate example is. But I think I could best sum it up, in my opinion, as that, collaboration is when we are working together to find shared ideas and shared opportunities to build a coalition a coalition of practitioners who are going to make compromises together and who are going to work for their neighbors as much as they work for themselves. Versus, I think cooperation is just providing a little bit of assistance or help. Great, I'd be happy to do that. So how do these training exchanges work? I think Ben is going to get into a lot of the fine details, but as a general overview, uh, kind of a map that we can overlay across any of our landscapes in the country. We've applied these ideas to training exchanges in Virginia and North Carolina, in the middle of the country, from Minnesota, Nebraska, Missouri, and Texas, Kansas. Um, and most recently, we've been working in some of our western states in New Mexico and Oregon, California. Integrating the private and public land in cooperative burning. Burning across the fence. These are the challenges that people are having right now because of absence of both cooperation and collaboration. Is trying to get fire across the fence or trying to get their neighbors on their land. And so, we see these challenges when federal and state agencies are trying to burn together, or nonprofit and state agencies, or when private individuals are trying to burn with the state or get assistance from state agencies. And so these training exchanges work because we are integrating the private and the public lands into cooperative burning. The host sites develop the burn units and the burn plans. Local, regional, and international participants provide the workforce. And fire training MOUs, or agreements between all our partnering hosts, enable us to take on the liability, enable the hosts to manage the liability using an administrative process like an MOU or an agreement. We use contracts for burn bosses, engines, meals, and lodging. Oftentimes during our 2-week training exchanges, we'll hire a caterer, we'll rent a lodge or a Boy Scout camp where everybody can stay. We've learned that by providing meals and lodging, you can often generate a lot of goodwill and volunteer work from others who will come and assist you in the burning. Our training curriculum includes local ecology, tactics, and strategies. Hosts provide specialists to deliver local curriculum. Participants are assigned to squads, modules, and engines. And an incident management team is created, and the daily planning cycle is followed. Crews and teams are intermixed so that each squad has a diverse makeup of firefighters. So, for example, we've been working fairly closely with municipal fire departments on the Colorado Front Range. And oftentimes a individual fire department will send a Type 6 engine or a fire engine with 4 or 5 guys and gals with it. And when that crew shows up at a training exchange, we split everybody up and put them into separate burn teams so they're not working with somebody that they typically work with. They get to work with other folks that they're meeting for the first time, be it a rancher or a farmer who just took their basic training, or a university student or a professor, um, air quality regulators, fire scientists and ecologists. And so we try to mix all of our participants up so they can maximize the learning from others and not just be reinforced from their home work team. We do use national training standards and position task books, as I mentioned, and many of our participants um, uh, you know, are attending so that they can gain additional training opportunities. Participants serve half the time as a trainer and half the time as a trainee. And they spend half the time in a qualified position where they're mentoring others, and then they provide, or they serve half the time in trainee positions where they're being mentored by others. So the next series of slides are just some best practices that we've learned um, over the last several years. Integrate the local resources and provide the required training. Just because somebody doesn't have the necessary training and equipment doesn't mean that we should exclude them from our burning. It just means that we need to work a little bit harder and provide that for them so that they can join us. They have a lot to contribute, and if we don't let them work with us, then we're not going to be able to learn from them. Organize, lead, and follow using the incident command system. Use plan section chiefs and training officers. Develop an incident action plan daily. Invite the media and show them a good time. So we've spent a lot of time and effort integrating the media into our operations and integrating training of our firefighters so that they can interview with the media and feel comfortable doing it. Know your agency guidelines and standards. Work with your attorneys and grant specialists. Use volunteer waivers, MOUs, and cooperative agreements. And then weather happens. Have contingency plans. In most cases, we're able to navigate these weather events because we have burn units spread out across an area at different elevations or different fuel types, including some pile burns where even if we're getting rain or snow, we're still able to go out and accomplish some good treatments. And then I'll finish with this series of photos and a short story. So we had been working with a private landowner near Gothenburg, Nebraska for several years, burning his ground. And he had been using some mechanical treatments to cut out the eastern red cedar trees that were on the flat ground. And then he was manually cutting down the trees on these steeper slopes. And after watching us burn on his property a couple of times, he started cutting and stuffing. So he would cut the lower row of the cedar trees at the bottoms of these draws, and then when we would come through and light up those lower rows, then the whole hillside would catch on fire, and it ended up being a very effective tactic. And so I don't know if you can see there in the background, but he's cut and stuffed those trees underneath at the base of the hill. And then as our firefighters were igniting just that lower row, you can see that the fire was moving upslope and consuming all of the trees. Trees that would not have been consumed had we only had the grass to burn from. Okay, so it's 12:30, and Sherry, would you like me to take just a second to um,
Yeah, we have one question pending, so I think you can probably answer that one, and then we'll go ahead and let Ben tell us about his part of the story.
Okay, great, thanks. So this is, how are you funding meals and lodging? A couple of different ways. Um, right now, we have a training exchange in North Carolina that has a $500 um, registration fee, and that per person, and that $500 is paying for the meals and lodging. And but typically, the Fire Learning Network is providing project dollars um, that support the meals and the lodging. We do ask all of our participants to pay a $100 registration fee for the 2 weeks, and but we have $20,000 to $30,000 of project money that helps us afford the meals and lodging, or in some cases we might have to hire a private contractor to be the burn boss, depending on jurisdiction. Um, Also, sometimes we're not operating in an area where there's already a fire program on the ground, and so we might need to rent an engine or some other staffing. And in those cases, then we use funds provided by the hosts and the Fire Learning Network to support the project.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. All right, so we're going to switch over, and Ben Wheeler is going to tell us a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of working across landscapes with multiple ownerships.
Right. Thank you, Sherry. And you know, um, the Trex model has been very good to us, and there's a variety, excuse me, of different Trexes across the country that Jeremy talked about, and it seems like each Trex kind of holds its own flavor, and so I guess what I'm going to get into is taking a look at that from the country as a whole, zeroing in on a microscope just to what's been working for us on the loops and how this matches with maybe a broader vision of what we hope to achieve here in the loop watershed. Because the loop Trex has really provided us an excellent platform to conduct some large-scale prescribed fires in central Nebraska and expand our fire capacity overall. Um, a lot of folks are probably familiar with this, but many people want to know why we conduct large prescribed fires, and this is not an exhaustive list, but basically for us, what it boils down to is some time economy. If you look at how long it would take to conduct 10 100-acre fires versus one 1,000-acre fire, um, sometimes in certain years we don't have 10 good days to burn, and so we're trying to um, use that time responsibly. With large fires, we can usually um, put safer burn boundaries around our units, get away from some hazardous areas just by enlarging and expanding our view. There's some ecological considerations. When we have larger fires, there's more trees that we can treat. It's typically a little bit more patchier, so we have some refugia areas for insects and small mammals and birds that do not get burned in a larger fire. Um, and the trees that we treat with these fires, the eastern red cedar that we deal with. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But burning larger areas um, tends to work in kind of a concentric circle fashion where we're really trying to um, affect um, more than just one small area, and then in also affecting the other trees that could also impact that area from reproduction. Furthermore, it nurtures a sense of community responsibility when we conduct large prescribed fires in central Nebraska. We're dealing with private ground, and it gives a lot of folks a common vision and a common goal on the landscape instead of just operating on their own private ground. And also, Jeremy talked a little bit about it before, but it's representative of some of our historical fire patterns in the area. So this is a kind of a view of a typical central Nebraska grassland that has been managed fairly well. And historically, as many folks know that might be from the Great Plains, fire was removed as a functional process on the landscape, and as the area was settled by white settlers. And this fire served, among many other things, to limit tree encroachment. And in addition to removing fire as a regulatory mechanism for minimizing tree encroachment, we decided to take it one step further and deliberately inject millions of more trees on our landscape in the forms of housing shelter belts, livestock windbreaks, and ornamentals. And this continues today. This photo is from Halsey, Nebraska, showing just rows of seedlings and thousands of little trees waiting for a new home. And here's a common example I often use for demonstration purposes. This is in central Nebraska, a 25-foot female eastern red cedar tree with all the berries. And I removed a 12-inch section off a branch, and I took off all the berries, and I had them scattered all over our living room floor, and my wife was not very excited about it. But just for demonstration purposes, I kind of asked people, how many berries do you think were on that stick? Just 12 inches of a 25-foot tree. To give you a better perspective, there they are all sitting down, and in that 12 sections, or in that 12 inches, there's 465 berries, which is a lot of berries. This is what it looks like when the berries are still on it. But this is kind of a moderate example. There'd be a lot more berries in an example like this when you see how many are on this. And this really is just to demonstrate the immense capacity for rapid expansion of eastern red cedar when those regulatory mechanisms are removed. And so in our grassland, as you can tell, eastern red cedar is one of our largest threats. And ultimately, we end up with a landscape that looks a lot like this. And from a wildlife standpoint, me being a wildlife biologist, grassland species are not going to really call this place home anymore. From a livestock production standpoint, again, we're working with private land here. You just imagine the acres and the profits that are just lost from all these trees. Grass does not grow underneath them. And unfortunately, although you look at this picture, although this is an extreme example, it is not an uncommon example at all. So moving into that, I'll back up a little bit to the Prescribed Fire Training Exchange, or the TREX, which Jeremy covered earlier. And the TREX itself, the way we see it in central Nebraska, is it's an opportunity for firefighters around the country and beyond to expand their fire line qualifications. We can involve multiple landowners. We can focus attention on specific resource concerns. And it's demonstrated the capacity for large-scale prescribed fire initiatives. In many examples, 20 to 30 firefighters, a 10 to 15 day, maybe even 21-day period, where firefighters can group up and tackle a mission. And so we took this as a where we saw the nexus of firefighters that are needing some training opportunities, and we have the resource concern and the land that we could do this on. So what makes the TREX a good fit on the loop? Well, the TREX, like we said before, the TREX operations demonstrated a capacity to burn large areas, and we still have large continuous grasslands that need to be burned. Right now in our area, it's still a relatively young fire culture, so we don't have a lot of private landowners with a lot of experience. Many of them are just getting into the fire world, and we have a lot of those folks that are involved in local prescribed burn associations or burn cooperatives between landowners, who average about 50 to 100 acres per fire. And at that rate, boy, we're just not keeping up with the rate of spread of our eastern red cedars. In addition to the young fire culture and these people just getting started, there's some perceived technical complications about size, safety, terrain, and land ownership patterns when it comes to conducting a large prescribed fire. And so by pulling in some professionals, having them come in and take the reins, at least at the beginning, we're able to introduce some of these concepts to these landowners that might be a little bit more palatable than just having them do it on their own. So this is a map of the United States of just up to, I believe this goes through 2014, through this year, of where all of our participants, our firefighters, have come. And they are representing the following agencies that are listed there. And in addition to all of those states that are listed, we also, I believe it was 2012, had an individual from South Africa, and last year we had 12 participants from Spain that represented the Spanish government from the national to the local level. To just give an idea of how much we've been able to treat, in 2010, we began doing our treks on the loop, and we treated over 4,400 acres. 2011, about the same. We had a good year in 2012, and then we skipped due to the drought in 2013, and then in 2014, a little over 4,000 acres. This upcoming year, we are targeting 3,800 acres for a total of over 20,000 acres in those five years of operating, which is really good news for us. If you want to see this on based on an image, this is kind of what it looks like, where we'd had our first one, our second one, 2012, 2014, and then this upcoming year, which will be in late March, there in western Custer County. At this point, at least visually, we're starting to make an impact on the larger landscape, both ecologically and socially as well. And people are beginning to be more exposed to prescribed fire, and there's certainly a level of comfort that is becoming ingrained in some of our private landowners as well. So as far as the loop is concerned, there's on my end, what I typically do is I'm responsible for getting everything set up from all the preparation and planning, so when our firefighters get on site, they're ready to go and they're ready to burn. And so we begin by identifying a prospective area, and when we do this, we generally target about 10 to 15,000 acres, with the hopes of ending up with about 4,000 to 5,000 workable acres that we can operate on. I pitch the concept to landowners, give them a meal, and discuss with them what we've done so far, how the program works, what their expectations. We discuss those and kind of where we go from there as well. Talk to them about the future, and we'll cover that here in a few slides. We begin developing burn units and burn plans. We coordinate the prep work, laying out fire breaks and things like that often falls on the landowner, so we have to coordinate that as well. So there's a lot of work that occurs before our firefighters step foot in Nebraska. As far as identifying areas, what I typically do is I try and find large contiguous areas of grasslands that have very few structures, not very many developed roads. And we also have to have interested landowners. When we deal with private land out here, this is a voluntary program, and so everybody has to be on the same page. Another thing that we look at is the capacity for future fire, and I'm going to talk about that a little at the end. But we really identify this as just the beginning stage for fire in our area, and we want to see this carried out into the future as well. And so we want to make sure that whatever we do now doesn't just end when our firefighters leave, but there's a vision towards the future. And we also use some wildlife models that I'll show you right here. This right here is central Nebraska, the area that I cover, and it's a geographic species occurrence model that we developed for the greater prairie chicken in the central Les Hills. And the greater prairie chicken is a grassland-dependent species, a bird that requires large tracts of grassland. colors. Green indicates areas where greater prairie chickens should occur, gradually transitioning into red where they probably will not occur, and then those areas in yellow on the fringes are kind of those intermediate areas. Now, while green is indicative of open grassland, the red corresponds to usually more cropland or grassland where eastern red cedar has severely invaded. And because of the greater prairie chicken spatial requirements, we use them as an umbrella species to demonstrate the suitability for other grassland wildlife as well, whether it be birds, amphibians, reptiles, mammals. And then we can use this map to target areas for on-the-ground grassland conservation. So we can identify areas like this. There's a lot of areas in green where we know there's going to be some good grassland habitat, or like the one furthest north, we can identify areas kind of in that intermediate model to try and pick it up a little bit and boost that up to green. But it provides us some areas that we can anchor into that we know are suitable habitat. If we focus in a little bit, you can see here, just to show you how it works, this is an example, fairly typical of our area, the grasslands in our area at least. The country is a little bit rugged and contains some trees in those areas, and when you look at it through the eyes of a greater prairie chicken, it looks a little bit like that. So you see the green that's suitable, and then over on the east and west side, east and west flanks there, where there's a little bit more trees, it's unsuitable. You can look at it again. In this example, we don't have as many trees, but there's some cropland in that area, and so those kind of tease out as well and aren't quite as green. So once we've identified an area based on our species model, and we've found an area that has all that grassland that we feel like we can function on, we identify all the private landowners in the area, and we invite them to a meeting, feed them, discuss with them how our Trex has operated in the past. Sometimes we'll have other firefighters come so they can talk. They might even be able to meet the burn boss. And in some cases, we have landowner participants from previous Trexes so they can share with them their experiences. So we begin by casting a pretty broad net. This is this upcoming year's Trex, but our broad net between 10 and 15 or 20,000 acres. And this map shows, like I said, the preliminary of the 2015. And in a perfect situation, everybody would commit to participating and want to be involved. But we know going into it that some landowners just aren't going to want to participate. And based upon who wants to participate and who doesn't, we then have to puzzle piece together a workable thesis of land that we can function on. Here's an example of our 2015 where about 6,000 acres of landowners want to participate. However, 6,000 acres is really getting beyond our capacity to complete with the number of firefighters that we have and the number of days. And it's also, you look at this map, some of the property boundaries fall along areas that we cannot safely create a boundary line. There's some pretty rough topography in there. So we have to make a decision there, and inevitably some folks that would like to participate will have to be cut off. Here's a different scenario of the same land where several landowners are interested, but their land holdings are not contiguous. And this would result into several small burns and would not be an efficient use of our resources. And so we would probably back out of an area like this too. And here's a real example where we've begun planning for our 2016 loop Trex, because like I said, these are private landowners that are usually involved in livestock operations. So they need to plan their grazing plans accordingly. Pull this down here. In this example, the red over here is people who do not want to participate, and over here on the east side, the green is folks who do, and the yellow is folks who aren't sure. Lately, they've actually turned over and they do want to participate, but people to the south here do not want to. Right now, this is 1,100 acres total, but these individuals are all absentee landowners. And so we are going to end up pulling out of this and looking at a different area because that goes back to their capacity to burn in the future. As an absentee landowner, they're probably not going to be burning here again when we leave. So we'll move a little bit into fire complex theory or fire complex approach. I don't know if it's a theory formally, but what we do in our treks, the loop treks, is we try and have a contiguous area that we're going to be burning that we can split into several different units. And by doing that, we can build what we're doing throughout the duration of the firefighter stay on the line. We can build off of previous burn units and add safety and time efficiency that we don't have to keep moving around the entire unit but can burn into previous units. And it also reveals options and different alternatives for other strategies. So this is from our 2014 treks, and you can see we have the whole area split into 4 different units. And ideally, a way we would like to treat this is to burn this north unit first, burn the east unit second. We can then burn this south unit by just pushing it into the east unit. And then, as you can see right now, burning the west unit is pretty simple because we don't really need to patrol this line very much or this line because it's already been burned into. That's where we can save a lot of our time. Another way we talked about being able to use alternative strategies is when we have contiguous burn units and a complex that's along these lines. If we get weather that is just uncooperative during our operations, contiguous areas with adjacent burn units allows us to take one full window of a day and try and burn 2 different units at once. So it gives us alternatives there. So the fire itself, as far as the fire is concerned, we really don't deal with anything on these larger fires or on ours that's any, or at least any tactical issues that smaller fires don't have to deal with. Some factors might be escalated with the size and or our crew composition, but we still have to make sure that the fire breaks are prepared. With the large size, it takes longer to do that. We have our boundary hazards. We have adjacent landowners that don't want to have anything to do with it. We have to deal with utilities and power lines. With a large fire, we might have to do more smoke screening. And then crew conditions. This is a one that we don't see as much on, or at least to this degree on smaller fires where we're pulling in crew from all over the country and beyond and trying to get a lot of things done with folks that have never burned before together. And then also their familiarity with the land is a little bit less because none of them have ever been there before usually. But we still have to deal with weather, and we still have to deal with the state and local regulations. And one thing we have to deal with is balancing firefighter and landowner expectations. So firefighters are trying to get as much training as they can. Landowners are trying to get as much burned as they can, and we do everything we can to try and complete that balance. So here's just a few pictures of what we have going on. This was this past year on the loop treks, and this was a successful day in that we had some members of, had a day where we invited members of the local fire departments to come out and join us. And so that added some resources and people to our line as well, in addition to exposing them to prescribed fire and getting them comfortable with some of the things that we're doing on the ground out there. I admit to ripping off a few pictures from the Niobrara treks, but here's some folks that are working up there on the Niobrara. Some folks from Spain and all over the country and all over the world, and some of the planning. In some cases, we even use late operations into the evening and night. And we get we receive our participants from all over the country, and we get them for a short window of time. But not every day in there is going to be good for burning. We're not always going to get the weather that we want, but we still have some windows that we can operate in. Since we are burning large units, we typically need a whole day of cooperative weather, but we can take advantage of smaller weather windows by blacklining and doing other activities that build crew cohesion. You can see them conducting that here on the loop treks. And one thing that firefighters really enjoy on our treks is, and I'm sure all the other treks as well, is they are able to get a wide variety of experiences out there, performing a lot of different tasks. Get a lot of things signed off on their task books. And just shuttle through a couple photos here. So I do want to take just a moment to give some credit to John Ortman. He helped me in the beginning to form the loop treks. The very first year we did it in 2010, and helped co-conspire with me to get that on the ground. We identified an area and talked to some landowners, and between my natural charm and his ruddy good looks, we were able to convince them that this was a good idea for their land. This past year, Jeremy talked about media. This past year, we were able to get our burn boss involved with an interview that did air on NPR, talking about what was going on in our area and how this was beneficial to wildlife and livestock. And this is a picture from the air of an area in the black that the landowners had finished up, and in the green here at the southeast, or the lower left-hand corner, is an area that we had burned with our crews, and that there was the black is the area that the landowners finished. But just wanted to give kind of an overall picture of the size that we are working on. And here's some of the products that we see at the end, the results. So when we get this over, typically, in our history on the loop treks, we have never burned everything, but we have never had a year where we didn't get anything burned. And so when we look at our efforts from 30,000 feet, the ultimate success of loop treks will be determined years from now, and our operations are meant to really only be an initial introduction to the fire for an area. And there's a lot of work between our loop treks and 7 or 8 years down the road to the next fire, when the landowners are going to be conducting it on their own. Some challenges to turning it over to them is a time commitment that they may have. Not many landowners can commit 10 to 21 days to something like this. Grabbing all the personnel that they might need. There's definitely a shortage in equipment capacity and experience capacity. Dealing with some of the landowners around there that are going to be inflexible. So there may be some folks that don't want to participate, and trying to expand that could be problematic. And there's also definitely a sense of cultural amnesia, where they're participating this year, but 5 or 6 years down the road, by then they've kind of forgotten about it. So as you can see here in this photo, we do have a lot of work between the loop treks and 7 8 years down the road to the next fire, to building up capacity and getting these folks where they're comfortable doing it on their own. But we do have a strong anchor point that we can, and a starting point that we can base from. So in the interim period between fires, there's a lot of things that we have to do. Developing a plan, developing a timetable to help offset that amnesia, encouraging a financial framework for future fire and preparation activities, and making sure that the activities that they need to perform before their next fire are realized within their annual budget. We have to work on maintaining regular communication with landowners, expand training and experience capacity, especially among leaders and burn bosses. increasing equipment capacity, building a list of potential personnel, because some of these folks, they're large landowners, and so they're going to have to draw from other friends, other neighbors to help out, and then also potentially expanding the boundaries to include new interested landowners. So this is my last slide, but this is kind of some of the results that we like to see out on our loop treks, and I just wanted to finish by mentioning that we did conduct a survey this last year. This is the first time we did it of the landowners that participated in the loop treks, and among the responses we got, all the responses were really favorable. Everybody was at least moderately satisfied with mortality on all size classes of their cedar trees. And as you would probably guess, the smallest size class, 1 foot and under, had the greatest level of satisfaction. But I was really encouraged by the economic impact that we were able to hit on. The respondents indicated spending at least $31,000 annually for eastern red cedar control. And because of our loop treks activities this past year, they projected a savings of at least $17,500 for the next year and over $40,000 over the next 5 years. And so we're really excited about that. Maybe even more importantly, we're really excited that all the respondents indicated an interest in burning again in 5 to 10 years from now. And that is in an area that is almost exclusively has not been burned since. Take any questions? I'm sure Jeremy is as well.
Thank you very much. Great presentations, both Jeremy and Ben. Folks, please go ahead and type your questions in the chat box, and we'll try to address them as they come out. And I'll just remind you that we did record this webinar. I did miss a couple of slides in the beginning. I apologize, Jeremy, but we will make that recording available afterwards. So it looks like the next question that we have is from Roger. He asked, how large of eastern red cedar can a burn control?
Go for it, Ben.
Yeah.
This is Roger. It's really dependent on what kind of preparation was done beforehand. We've been able to get mortality on even our largest size classes, so 25, 30, 35 foot trees. But on our loop treks, we really stress to our participants and our landowners, you're going to get out of this what you put in. And if you put in those preparation activities where you're resting your grass from your cattle, you're cutting some other trees and maybe stuffing them up and letting those dry out, all those things are going to help build and achieve more mortality among your larger trees. But that being said, on our loop treks with our landowners, we do not have any requirements for them to do so. And I kind of like it that way, that we leave it up to them. You're going to get the success out of it that you put in, because I think that's a very good segue for the 7 to 8 years down the road, where this is kind of their responsibility to start taking up. Did you want to add to that, Jeremy?
No, that's right on, Ben. Thanks.
I think
I see this next question, Sherry. One of the big challenges with many of the task books is finding opportunity to complete the W, or the wildfire tasks. Have you found a way to satisfy these requirements of these tasks? Well, during 2 of our training exchanges, one in Kansas and one in Nebraska, in fact, just last year on the loop, I believe, there were red flag days where we ceased operations and we made ourselves available to the local county for fire response. In both of those situations, we were called upon and we responded to local wildfires and assisted the local volunteer fire departments in containment of those fires. And in those cases, we had already pre-planned the opportunities for some of our participants who were most in need of W tasks or wildfire tasks to be evaluated. So we actually were able to do several Ws on a training exchange. However, I think the more permanent strategy that we're creating is we're developing partnerships. So when we have, for example, a Pheasants Forever or a Nature Conservancy or another nonprofit organization who mostly focuses on prescribed fire, and they're coming out to a training exchange, and we also have U.S. Forest Service or National Park Service or BLM, Bureau of Land Management firefighters that are coming out to gain experience. Um, when those folks get to meet each other and interact and build a relationship, then there's an opportunity for them to, in the future, to exchange work. And so we have been able to get numerous prescribed fire practitioners assigned to contract engines, to federal assignments, to federal engines, where they go on a temporary assignment so that they can get evaluated on wildfires. And if you want to have a longer, deeper conversation about position task books and trying to complete them efficiently, feel free to call me or write offline, and we can talk more about it. But certainly, it is a big challenge in the prescribed fire community because a lot of organizations and agencies have adopted NWCG, which is really focused on suppression efforts. And it's very difficult if you're only completing prescribed fires to get to advance your qualifications.
So it looks like the next question, how long ahead of a burn do you have to get the burn plans written ahead of the actual burn?
I think that varies across the country depending on what regulatory issues that they're managing for. In some places, the permit is obtained from the local fire chief, and you might only need to provide him your burn plan a week or two ahead of time. But I think most of our burn plans are being completed a couple of months ahead of time, and they're being reviewed by a colleague, and then they're being shared with the participants before they arrive, so that the burn boss trainees, as they're coming on site, have already had an opportunity to review the burn plans.
And Ben, it sounds like you're almost working on those years ahead.
Burn plan years ahead as much as I'm working on the landowner plan years ahead. With these folks being livestock producers, if they want to rest their grass, the 2000 loop treks, if they want to rest their grass, they have to start thinking about grazing plans for this year. And so we generally like to target and begin our planning efforts about 18 months ahead of time, where we can start planning those things and getting people geared up and ready to go and on the same page. But the plan itself does not have to be, the document does not have to be together that far ahead of time.
And let me just ask, we'll have Ben ask this first from the Nebraska standpoint, and then maybe Jeremy can think about it from a wider perspective. I do a lot of monitoring, and that's kind of what I'm paid to do. And so I'm wondering, when you are evaluating your objectives and whether they're achieved or not, what kinds of monitoring are you doing, and what are the landowners doing to evaluate whether those burns are success?
For us, I think since we've started doing them in 2010, our monitoring has certainly evolved. Whereas before we were really geared towards going out and